The heavy oak doors of the law office held out the damp November rain, but inside, the air was cold enough to freeze water. I sat near the window of the third-floor conference room, watching the gray mist cling to the high windows of the county courthouse across the street. Beside me, my mother's lifelong best friend, Evelyn, sat in a dark velvet coat. Her back was as straight as an iron rail, her hands resting calmly over the silver head of her walking cane. She hadn't spoken a word since we walked into the building, but her quiet presence was the only thing keeping my knees from buckling. My mother, Martha Vance, had passed away 3 weeks ago after a brief, brutal illness. She was 68 years old. She spent 40 years as a high school principal, a woman who lived by rules, schedules, and an unwavering sense of fairness. She raised me alone after my father died when I was 7, balancing a tight school budget while ensuring our family home and her modest savings were protected for the long haul. Across the broad mahogany conference table sat my stepbrother, Julian, and his wife, Victoria. Julian was 36, 4 years older than me. He was my stepfather's son from a previous marriage. When my mother married his father 15 years ago, she treated Julian like her own flesh and blood. But Julian always viewed the world through a grid of numbers and shortcuts. For the last 6 years, he'd been running an independent asset management firm, which, as far as anyone in the family could tell, meant renting a high-end corner office downtown, wearing tailored suits he couldn't afford, and pitching high-yield real estate investments that always seemed to require someone else's emergency capital to survive. Sitting next to Julian was his attorney, a sleek, sharp-eyed man named Richard Sterling. Sterling wore a double-breasted charcoal suit and kept tapping a heavy gold fountain pen against a thick leather document folio. "Thank you all for arriving promptly," Sterling said, his voice clipped and dry as dried autumn leaves. He opened the binder and smoothed down a set of typed pages with his palm. "We are here today for the formal reading and administrative distribution of the last will and testament of the late Martha Vance." Julian leaned back in his leather chair, adjusting his silk tie with a slow, practiced casualness. He didn't look at me. He looked at the far wall, a slight, satisfied smirk sitting on the corner of his lips. "Before we begin," Sterling continued, clearing his throat, "I want to emphasize that this document was formally executed and filed with the county recorder's office 4 months ago, replacing all prior testamentary instruments. Under the terms set forth herein, your late mother designated a primary executor to manage the liquidation and settlement of her entire estate." Sterling picked up the top page and began reading in a monotone, rhythmic drawl. "I, Martha Vance, being of sound mind and disposing memory, do hereby revoke all prior wills and codicils. Section 2. Real property and assets. I hereby devise, bequeath, and transfer my primary residence located at 1420 Elmridge Way, along with all associated land titles, liquid accounts, and personal property, entirely to my stepson, Julian Vance, to act as sole administrator and primary beneficiary." My heart didn't leap, it dropped straight into my stomach, turning heavy as lead. The Elmridge property? That was the 4-acre family estate my mother's parents had built in 1952. My mother had told me 100 times, on her porch, in her kitchen, and at her hospital bedside during her final week, that the house was meant to be divided equally between Julian and me, with a specific educational trust carved out for her 2 grandchildren. I opened my mouth to speak. My voice caught in the back of my throat. "Wait, that's not..." Before I could finish the sentence, Evelyn leaned sideways toward me. Her hand reached out, her gloved fingers pinching my forearm with a grip so sudden and fierce it made me catch my breath. She didn't look at Julian. She didn't look at the attorney. Her eyes remained fixed on the white pages in Sterling's hands. She leaned her head closer to my ear. Her breath was warm against the freezing air of the room, her voice dropping into a razor-sharp whisper that barely carried across the mahogany table. "That's not the will she wrote." I froze. I turned my head slowly to look at her. Evelyn's expression hadn't changed. Her posture was still motionless, her face a mask of sorrowful respect. But her jaw was set like granite. "Evelyn," I whispered back, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. "What are you talking about?" "Keep your mouth shut, David," she whispered, her eyes never leaving Sterling's moving lips. Don't object. Don't raise your voice. Don't give them a single clue that we know. Let him finish reading. Across the table, Sterling stopped reading for a fraction of a second. He looked up over his thin reading glasses, his eyes sweeping from Evelyn to me. Is there a question, Mr. Vance? Sterling asked, his tone dripping with fake legal empathy. I know this is emotional, but the language is unequivocal. Your mother felt that Julian's corporate background made him better suited to handle the complex liquidation of her holdings. Julian turned his head slowly, looking at me with a faint, condescending tilt of his chin. It's about duty, David, Julian said softly, his voice smooth and empty. Mom knew you had your hands full with your teaching career. She wanted someone who knew how to handle commercial property and tax releases so the house didn't sit there decaying. I felt a surge of heat rush up my neck, but Evelyn's fingers tightened on my arm like a steel clamp. Please continue, Mr. Sterling, Evelyn said aloud, her public voice sweet, fragile, and entirely calm. We are listening. Sterling gave a curt nod and returned to the paper. Section 3. Contingent Personal Bequests. To my son, David Vance, I leave the personal contents of the oak desk located in the secondary study, along with a lump sum disbursement of $10,000, to be paid out following the final sale and closing of the Elmridge property. $10,000. Out of an estate valued at nearly $2 million, including a paid-off 4-acre property in one of the fastest-growing residential zones in the county. Julian leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, watching my face to see if I would snap. He wanted a scene. He wanted me to yell, to smash a fist on the table, to act like an unstable, bitter heir so Sterling could document it in his administrative notes. I forced my hands to stay flat on my lap. I forced my breathing to stay slow and steady. This document has been stamped by the county clerk, Sterling concluded, sliding the stapled pages across the smooth wood toward me. Julian has already signed the preliminary petition for probate administration. As executor, he will be changing the locks on the Elmridge property this evening at 5 o'clock to secure the estate's physical assets. Changing the locks? I blurted out before I could stop myself. All of my mother's personal journals are in that house. My father's old military records are in her study. And they will be preserved, David, Julian said, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket. Under my supervision. I'll let you know when you can come by to pick up your box of desk items. Say, next Saturday? After the preliminary estate appraiser finishes his walkthrough. He didn't wait for an answer. Julian turned to Sterling, shook his hand, and walked out of the conference room, his wife trailing right behind him with a quiet rustle of her designer coat. The heavy door clicked shut. The room fell into absolute silence except for the steady pitter-patter of rain against the window pane. I turned to Evelyn, my hands trembling as I stared at the copy of the forged will sitting on the table. Evelyn, what did you mean back there? What do you know? Evelyn slowly stood up, placing both hands on the silver top of her cane. She looked down at the paper, then up at me, her eyes bright with a sharp, fierce light that completely contradicted her frail 72-year-old frame. Your mother was a high school principal for 40 years, David, Evelyn said quietly. Do you really think she would hire a sleazy strip mall lawyer like Richard Sterling to draft her final estate documents? Sterling isn't her lawyer? Her lawyer was Arthur Pendleton, the man who handled your grandfather's farm trust 40 years ago, Evelyn said, her voice dropping into a hard, cold register. And 2 months ago in September, not July like that paper says, your mother called me at 7 in the morning. She asked me to drive her to the main branch of the First National Bank downtown. My chest tightened. Why? Because she discovered that Julian had taken out a $150,000 personal loan against his firm, using a fake corporate guarantee, Evelyn said. She knew he was in deep financial trouble. She went to that bank, opened a secure safety deposit box, and placed 3 things inside it. Evelyn stepped closer to me, resting her hand lightly on my shoulder. She put her original 2018 will inside that box. The the one that leaves the house to you and Julian jointly, with you named as sole executor. She put a ledger recording every penny she ever lent him. And she put a small, leather-bound notebook containing 6 months of recorded telephone conversations between Julian and a private land developer who wanted to tear down Elmridge Way to build a shopping strip. I stared at her, the blood rushing in my ears. "Where is the key to that deposit box?" Evelyn smiled, a sharp, cold, dangerous smile that made my skin prickle. "Your mother didn't keep the key in her purse, David," she whispered. "And she didn't keep it on her desk. She hid it inside the one thing she knew Julian would treat as worthless junk. The $10,000 desk item," I breathed. "No," Evelyn said, leaning in close. "The old iron-bound sewing box in her bedroom vanity. Julian told the movers to leave in the hallway because it smelled like old oil." She glanced at her gold wristwatch, then looked straight into my eyes. "It is 3:15, David. Julian told Sterling he's changing the locks on Elmridge Way at 5 o'clock today. That gives us exactly 95 minutes to get into that house, find that sewing box, and pull the pin out from under your stepbrother's feet." By 4 o'clock, the afternoon sky had turned a dark, bruised violet. The rain lashed against the windshield of Evelyn's Buick as we turned onto Oakridge Lane, the tires kicking up wet, orange oak leaves along the side of the road. The ancestral house, 1420 Elmridge Way, sat on a gentle rise, framed by 4 massive white oaks that my grandfather had planted when he came back from the war. It was a broad, 2-story stone and timber home built to survive generations. Seeing it now, with its dark, unlit windows, sent a cold pang through my chest. My mother had taken her last breath in the downstairs bedroom less than a month ago. "Park behind the garage," Evelyn directed, pointing with her silver-headed cane. "If Julian or his real estate friends drive by before 5, we don't want them seeing your car in the driveway." I pulled around the back, cutting the engine. The silence inside the car was absolute, broken only by the steady drumbeat of rain on the roof. "We have 40 minutes, David," Evelyn said, checking her gold wristwatch. "Julian said he'd be here at 5 with the locksmith to change the locks. We get in, get the key, drive to the bank downtown, and open that box before tomorrow morning." We stepped out into the damp chill. I pulled my coat tight, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I used my original brass house key, the one I'd carried since high school, to unlock the heavy kitchen back door. The latch clicked open with a familiar, mechanical thud. Inside, the house smelled of old peppermint tea, cedar, and dried flowers, the unmistakable scent of my mother's life. But there was something else in the air, the faint, stale odor of disruption. Boxes were stacked against the hallway walls. Blue painter's tape was stuck onto several pieces of antique furniture, marking them for auction. Julian had already started inventorying her life like a liquidator carving up a bankrupt store. "Focus, David," Evelyn said softly, putting a firm hand on my shoulder. "Upstairs." Her vanity. We moved quickly up the broad wooden staircase, our footsteps muffled by the runner rug. The master bedroom was chilly and quiet. The bed was neatly made, just as my mother had left it before her final hospital stay. In the corner, sitting under the high oval mirror, was the dark mahogany vanity desk. On top of it sat a tarnished, heavy iron-bound sewing box, an old, heavy piece with a forged latch, forged over 80 years ago by a local blacksmith. Julian's appraiser had left a pink inventory sticker on top of it. Item number 142, vintage iron/wood tool, minimal value. "He thinks it's a piece of junk," I murmured, staring at it. "That's why she chose it," Evelyn said, stepping beside me. "Julian only looks at things with dollar signs attached. He never looked at the history." I stepped forward and reached for the iron latch. It was stubborn, stiffened by decades of rust and disuse, but with a hard tug of my thumb, the lid popped open with a dry metallic spring. Inside lay spools of faded thread, brass thimbles, old wooden buttons, and a pair of heavy tailor's shears. I began lifting out the top wooden tray, revealing the bottom compartment lined with faded velvet. "Is it there?" Evelyn asked, leaning over my shoulder, her voice tight with anticipation. I pushed aside 3 old spools of black embroidery thread. Resting at the very bottom, wrapped in a square piece of heavy greaseproof paper, was a small, flat brass key. Attached to it was a hard plastic blue tag stamped with a 4-digit number. Number 4082, First National Bank downtown. Found it, I whispered, holding the key up to the gray light coming through the bedroom window. Thank God, Evelyn breathed, closing her eyes for a brief second. Now wrapped around it, is there a card? I unwrapped the heavy paper. Inside was not just the key, but a small folded slip of paper in my mother's unmistakable, crisp principal's handwriting. I unfolded it and read aloud. David, if you are reading this with Evelyn, it means Julian has chosen his path. The bank vault holds the truth. Do not compromise. Do not negotiate. Protect what your grandfather built. Mom. A wave of emotion hit me, tightening my throat, but before I could process it, the sound of a heavy car engine echoed from the driveway outside. Headlights swept across the bedroom ceiling, casting long, moving shadows against the wallpaper. Evelyn went rigid. Who is that? It's only 4:20. I hurried to the front window, peeling back the heavy lace curtain just enough to look down at the driveway. A sleek black SUV had pulled up to the front porch. The driver's door opened, and Julian stepped out into the rain, holding an umbrella over his head. But he wasn't alone. Stepping out of the passenger side was Richard Sterling, the attorney, carrying his heavy leather briefcase. And out of the back seat stepped a broad-shouldered man in a gray work uniform, carrying a heavy metal toolbox and an electric drill case. They brought the locksmith early, I said, my blood running cold. Julian's not waiting until 5. We can't walk out the front door, Evelyn said, her voice turning sharp and tactical. If Julian sees us with that key, he'll know instantly what we're doing. He'll file an emergency injunction or physically try to delay us until the bank closes at 5:30. Downstairs, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed as Julian used his master key to unlock the front door. The front door creaked open, and Julian's voice carried clearly up the open stairwell. Go ahead and start with the front door deadbolts, Ray, Julian was saying to the locksmith, his tone arrogant and loud. Then we'll move inside to the study safe. I want every lock on this house rekeyed before 5 o'clock tonight. What about the heir? The locksmith's deep voice asked. The brother. He's been notified, Julian replied smoothly. He won't be back until the weekend. Let's get to work. Evelyn looked at me, her eyes flashing with determination. She pointed toward the back hallway. The old servant stares through the laundry pantry. It leads straight out to the back porch near my Buick. Evelyn, you're Kane, I whispered. Can you make it down those narrow stairs in the dark? David, Evelyn said, her voice dropping into a razor-thin growl. I've known this house for 50 years. I could walk those stairs blindfolded. Grab that key, put that iron box back exactly where it was, and let's go. I slipped the brass key and the paper note deep into my coat pocket. I carefully replaced the spools of thread, shut the iron latch of the sewing box, and set it back on the vanity desk in its exact position. We slipped out of the master bedroom, moving like ghosts down the dark wood corridor just as the whining screech of an electric drill began echoing through the front foyer downstairs. The rain was coming down in sheets by the time Evelyn's Buick pulled into the subterranean parking garage beneath the First National Bank building downtown. It was 5:10 p.m. The broad, polished granite lobby was quiet, illuminated by low brass fixtures and the ambient glow of security monitors. We moved quickly past the security desk toward the safe deposit vault in the basement. Evelyn walked with purpose, her cane clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. Mr. Vance, Mrs. Evelyn, the elderly vault custodian, Arthur Pendleton, greeted us with a polite nod as we approached the heavy steel gate. A bit late in the afternoon for a box visit, isn't it? We only need a few minutes, Arthur, Evelyn said smoothly, offering a gentle smile. Martha's estate paperwork needs a quick verification. Arthur unlocked the iron day gate and led us into the reinforced vault room. Wall-to-wall polished steel deposit boxes lined the room from floor to ceiling. He took my brass key, number 4082, inserted his master key alongside it into the twin keyholes, and rotated both cylinders in unison. Clack. The heavy steel door swung open. I reached in and pulled out the long, metallic inner box, carrying it over to one of the private viewing booths at the back of the vault. I lifted the hinged lid. Inside sat 3 items, exactly as Evelyn had described. The original 2018 last will and testament, typed on heavy bond paper, signed by my mother in clear blue ink, and stamped by her longtime attorney. It explicitly divided all real estate and liquid assets 50-50 between Julian and me, naming me as the primary executor. The personal ledger, a bound black ledger detailing 6 years of personal loans made to Julian, totaling $185,000, none of which had been repaid. The microcassette tapes and audio transcripts, a leather folder containing labeled tapes and transcribed phone conversations between Julian and an executive at Apex Horizon Realty, LLC. I flipped through the audio transcripts, my eyes skimming the typed pages. The Elmridge property sits directly on the new commercial easement corridor, Julian's voice was transcribed as saying. Once the old lady passes, I'll file an updated administrative will. My attorney, Sterling, can push it through probate before David even realizes he's been cut out. We can break ground on the shopping strip by summer. My hands shook as I held the transcript. He didn't just forge her signature, Evelyn. He planned to bulldoze our family home for a commercial buyout scheme. And that's why he brought the locksmith to the house today, Evelyn said, her voice turning cold and sharp. He knew that if you found this box, his entire real estate operation would collapse. Before I could answer, the vault door behind us creaked open. I'm glad you brought all the evidence together in one room, David. A voice echoed through the concrete vault. It saves my team the trouble of hunting it down. I spun around. Standing in the doorway of the vault room was Richard Sterling, holding a manila folder, flanked by Julian and 2 uniformed off-duty officers holding temporary civil administrative holds. Julian stepped into the light of the vault, a triumphantly smug grin on his face. He adjusted his silk tie and looked down at the metal box in my hands. You really thought you were being clever, didn't you? Julian said softly, stepping closer. Running off with the key from the old sewing box? Arthur down at the desk was kind enough to give Sterling a call the moment your key was checked out. You forged Mom's will, Julian, I said, stepping between him and the box on the table. I have the 2018 original right here, along with your recorded transcripts with Apex Horizon. Sterling stepped forward, taking off his glasses and wiping them with a silk handkerchief. Mr. Vance, those recordings are unauthorized audio intercepts, entirely inadmissible in civil court. Furthermore, the document Julian filed this morning carries a formal notary seal. As far as the county probate clerk is concerned, that 2018 document in your hands was superseded 4 months ago. It was forged. Evelyn snapped, taking a step forward and raising her cane. Martha never signed your fraudulent paper. A claim that would take 18 months of expensive forensic handwriting litigation to prove in court, Mrs. Evelyn, Sterling replied smoothly. By which time, the Elmridge property will have already been sold under executor authority to satisfy Julian's corporate debt obligations. Julian smiled, holding out his hand. Hand over the box, David. Or my officers here will cite you for civil interference with an active estate administration. The room went completely quiet. The air felt heavy, suffocating, and cold. Then, from the hallway outside the vault, a heavy set of footsteps echoed against the marble tiles. I wouldn't advise taking that box, Julian, a deep, authoritative voice called out. Everyone turned. Stepping into the vault doorway was a tall, silver-haired man in a dark trench coat. He carried a heavy leather binder under his arm and displayed a gold badge clipped to his inner coat pocket. Evelyn let out a long breath. You're late, Marcus. The man stepped forward, his eyes locked directly on Richard Sterling and Julian. Senior Special Investigator Marcus Vance, Public Corruption and Financial Crimes Division, he said, his voice level and hard as granite. And nobody is touching that box. Investigator Marcus Vance stepped fully into the vault, his heavy leather coat damp from the rain. Behind him stood 2 uniformed deputies, their presence instantly cutting off the narrow room's only exit. Sterling's slick demeanor shattered in a fraction of a second. He took a nervous step back, bumping into Julian, who looked as if he had just seen a ghost. "Investigator Vance," Sterling stuttered, his voice losing its polished edge. "This is a private probate matter. We are executing an administrative hold authorized under state civil code." "Save it, Sterling," Marcus said, pulling a folded white document from his coat and handing it straight to Sterling. "That's a formal freeze order issued by the circuit court 30 minutes ago, backed by a felony search and seizure warrant for all paper and digital assets tied to Apex Horizon Realty and Sterling and Associates." Julian's face went entirely pale. "A freeze order? On what grounds?" "On the grounds of wire fraud, grand larceny, and the criminal forgery of a deceased principal's estate records," Marcus replied, his voice calm, icy, and unwavering. Marcus turned his head toward me and Evelyn, giving us a short, reassuring nod. "David, hand me the small leather folder from that metal box." I lifted the leather sleeve containing the microcassettes and transcribed phone logs, handing it directly to Marcus. Marcus unzipped the binder and held up one of the mini-tapes. 3 weeks ago, before Martha passed, she knew something was wrong with her account ledgers. She installed a certified recording tap on her home landline, with full authorization from my department after reporting an attempted financial extortion scheme. Julian swallowed hard, his hands trembling at his sides. She recorded me? "She recorded 16 separate phone calls, Julian," Marcus said, looking him dead in the eye. "Calls where you explicitly discussed forging her signature on a revised 2024 will, using Richard Sterling's office notary seal after hours, and assigning the Elmridge Way land title over to Apex Horizon to clear your $2 million corporate debt. Those recordings are illegal." Julian shrieked, his composure completely breaking. "She couldn't do that. She was the account holder and the property owner, Julian," Marcus said flatly. "And under state financial exploitation laws regarding vulnerable adults, those tapes are fully admissible evidence." Sterling backed away, raising his hands in immediate surrender. "I was only acting as legal counsel based on the documentation provided to me by my client. If Mr. Vance provided forged instruments, my firm was entirely unaware." "Don't even try it, Sterling," Julian snarled, turning his head sharply toward his lawyer. "You drafted the entire fraudulent codicil. You took a $50,000 cash retainer out of my escrow account this morning to push it through probate before David found out." "Both of you keep your mouths shut," Marcus commanded softly. He turned to the 2 uniformed officers waiting at the door. "Take them upstairs. Book them on preliminary counts of felony forgery, conspiracy, and attempted estate fraud. Federal bank fraud charges will follow once the forensic accounting team finishes with Sterling's office servers." The 2 deputies stepped forward. The metallic click-clack of handcuffs echoed loudly inside the concrete vault. Julian didn't fight as the steel cuffs snapped around his wrists. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of rage, desperation, and total ruin. "David, please. You can't let them do this. We're family. Think about what Mom would want." I looked at him, feeling no anger, only a deep, quiet sadness for the man he had chosen to become. "Mom did think about it, Julian," I said softly, holding up the small piece of grease-proof paper she had left in the sewing box. "She left a note. She said, 'Do not compromise. Do not negotiate. Protect what your grandfather built. You brought this on yourself.'" The officers guided Julian and Sterling out of the vault, their heavy footsteps fading up the marble corridor until the heavy steel doors swung shut, leaving only Evelyn, Marcus, and me standing in the warm light of the deposit room. Evelyn let out a long, heavy sigh, resting both hands on her silver-headed walking cane. She turned to me, her eyes softening. "Your mother was a smart woman, David. She knew Julian would try to sweep everything away the moment she was gone. But she made sure the truth was locked where no lie could touch it." "And now?" I asked, looking down at the original 2018 lying safely on the table. "Now," Marcus said, stepping beside us and resting a large hand on my shoulder, "we take this document directly to the chief probate judge. Elmridge Way stays in the Vance family, exactly as your grandfather and mother intended." The weeks that followed the confrontation inside the vault moved with the slow, deliberate pace of judicial justice. Within 48 hours of the arrests, the story of Richard Sterling's office and the falsified Vance estate hit the regional press, triggering an emergency judicial audit by the state Supreme Court into all probate filings processed through Sterling's firm. Forensic document examiners confirmed that my mother's signature on the July 2024 will was a high-resolution trace forgery, executed using a stolen vector signature file from her former school district retirement forms. Julian and Sterling were denied bail on account of flight risk and substantial financial resources. The preliminary investigation revealed that Julian's asset management firm was nothing more than an elaborate shell scheme, holding nearly $2.1 million in commercial debt. His plan to sell Elmridge Way to Apex Horizon Realty was his final desperate gamble to avoid a federal indictment for wire fraud. By late December, the 2nd District Probate Court formally struck the forged document from the record and admitted my mother's original 2018 last will and testament into full probate administration. Under the terms of the real will, the 4-acre Elmridge Way estate was preserved in a family trust under my sole control. The $10,000 cash bequest was reallocated from Julian's seized personal accounts, while his claim to any portion of the estate was entirely stripped under the enforceability of the will's explicit disinheritance clause regarding fraudulent challenge. On a crisp, sunny afternoon in early spring, 6 months after my mother's passing, I stood on the broad back porch of Elmridge Way. The heavy rain of autumn was long gone. The white oaks my grandfather had planted in 1952 were beginning to bloom with pale green buds, casting long, peaceful shadows across the lawn. The front doors had long since been fitted with new, secure brass deadbolts, not installed by Julian's locksmith under the threat of eviction, but fitted by my own hands. The house was quiet, no longer carrying the heavy weight of lingering greed or betrayal. A black Buick pulled smoothly up the gravel driveway. The door opened, and Evelyn stepped out into the afternoon air, resting her hands over the silver head of her walking cane. She wore a simple dark cardigan and looked out across the lawn with a soft, peaceful expression. "You've kept the porch painted, David," Evelyn said as she walked up the wooden steps, her voice carrying that familiar, grounded warmth. "Your mother always hated seeing peeling paint on the railings." "I spent all weekend working on it," I smiled, pulling out a chair for her at the porch table. "It feels good to keep it looking the way she wanted." I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small, velvet-lined wooden box, setting it gently on the wooden table between us. Inside sat the small brass key, number 4082, the grease-proof paper note, and the tarnished iron latch for my mother's vintage sewing box. Evelyn reached out, her fingers lightly brushing the cold metal of the latch. "She knew, Evelyn," I said softly, looking over the quiet lawn. "She knew Julian was coming for this place long before he ever realized she saw through him." "Your mother spent 40 years managing teenagers and school boards, David," Evelyn said with a quiet chuckle, her eyes twinkling with a touch of wit. "She knew how to spot a lie from a mile away. But more than that, she knew who she could trust to stand firm when the storm hit." She looked at me, her posture upright, her expression completely serene. "You didn't bow down to Sterling's threats in that conference room," Evelyn continued, resting her hand over mine. "You listened, you held your ground, and you let the truth do the heavy lifting. That's what made your mother's legacy strong. That's what made her script unbreakable." We sat on the porch for a long time, watching the sunlight play across the grass, listening to the gentle rustle of the oak leaves overhead. A home restored, a family's honor protected, and a truth that no forgery could ever erase.